Tom. Well. Dominique Anglade called it quits this morning. We have the short version, Brian. Here it is of her making the announcement today from earlier this morning. Here you go.
Having in mind the interest of Quebec and the good of the party, I have informed the party president of my resignation as the leader of the Quebec Liberal Party. I am also announcing that I will step down as the member of the National Assembly for Saint-Henri-Sainte-Anne on December 1st.
So, Tom, my first question would have been, how surprised were you? But I know you were, because we talked about this in the past. You thought you'd stick it out for a while longer.
I really did, and I had a good conversation with her just last week. I've spoken to her twice in the past 2 weeks. First around this Mary-Claude Nichols event, to try to get the story from her point of view. And it's important in my work to try to talk to everybody, which I try to do. And then I spoke to her last week because, there was a bit of piling on. Several people from the past, a former party president saying that she would have to get 97% in her evaluation, vote by the party members when there's a review in a year. And so I asked her how she was feeling, and she said, well, I have no intention of stepping down. I said, well, you're not telling me that you're not going to step down. You're telling me you have no intention. And she goes, well, when I left politics the first time, I made the mistake of saying I'll never go back in politics again, so I've learned to never say never. So I did get the impression that she was leaving the door open. I was able to talk to one of her most senior advisors today, and that person said, look, with what, the piling on that was occurring, she took stock of the situation with her family. They're very close-knit. She's got 3 adolescent kids who are great, and she just simply decided, this is it. I'm throwing in the towel. And I think she did very well during that press conference. She held the whole thing together, showed a lot of class, but it must be very, very difficult.
Tom, I said earlier when we discussed this, we're not going to know, if we ever will, exactly how this all shook out. But if you had to guess, this was not her looking in the mirror one day and deciding, okay, I got to go. The pressure from within the party, is that what ultimately made that the choice for her?
Yeah, but I mean, it's the number of people who were moving in. Usually when you have something like this happen in a party, like the whole time that Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister of Canada, you had the Paul Martin wing of the Liberal Party, pushing hard. They figured that Paul Martin should be given his chance, and he eventually got his chance, but it didn't go very well for him, as we all recall. But when you're pulling off this sort of stunt, you've got an idea of who you want to replace that person with. When it was decided, and I was in the Liberal Party of Quebec at the time, that Daniel Johnson was going to be replaced by Jean Charest, there was a plan. There were people involved, and there was the name of something. But here, it just seemed to be a wrecking crew, intent on going after Anglade. The only name that comes up, and I'm not suggesting directly or indirectly, but the only name that comes up time and again is Jean Charest's name, I guess simply because so many of the people who were doing the hardest pushing and shoving against Anglade were very close to Charest. But I doubt very much that would actually come to pass, but that is the only name that I've heard from several people, as a matter of fact, today.
I just want to clarify, when you say that's the name you heard, do you mean as a successor, or do you mean as someone from the inside trying to push her out?
No, I don't think he was trying to push her out. In fact, I was told that he spoke to her over the weekend. And so, no, I don't think he in any way tried to push her out. But the idea of a lot of the people who are still in the party is they've got to get the next Jean Charest. And I'm not sure that the Quebec Liberal Party has the next Jean Charest that they can just tap into.
So, but are you suggesting that he is a potential successor, that he might actually come back?
Look, and that's going to be up to him. We saw that he was still very much interested in politics when he ran for the Conservative leadership just a couple of months ago. Maybe he is the type of person who'd be interested in that sort of comeback. Who knows? Robert Bourassa certainly came back.
Yeah, although I said when this came up earlier, Natasha, right? I said, I mean, it's one thing because, yes, he came back to run, nationally, but he took a real beating, Tom, during that election. Is that enough to make you think, okay, maybe that party's over. I don't need to go back?
Could very well be, but, he's still got a pretty high evaluation amongst a lot of Quebecers. Sure. There are a few casseroles that follow behind his car as he clunks down the street. There are some ethical issues that have never been resolved in the public's mind. But at the same time, he did very well for the Liberal parties while he was there. But I don't see anybody in the offing. I'm told that Pierre Molyneux is very interested, a former minister. But again, he's well into his 60s, and the next election's in 4 years. So you've got to really come to a decision as to whether or not you want somebody who's going to be well on in years, or you need somebody who represents the newer generation, as of course Anglade did. I think that the smart money, Aaron and Natasha, is going to be that the Liberals will go back to what they've always had in the past, because, of course, Dominic Anglade was the only woman they had and was the only member of any visible minority to have ever headed up a political party in Quebec. So put your money on the Liberals finding a white male.
Yeah, I think so, too. Sadly, I will say Jean Charest is the name that came up most frequently on our text line, Tom. I want to know, do you think if this Mary-Claude Nichols, Nicole thing had never happened, would we be in the same situation, or would Dominic Anglade be continuing as leader?
You know, when the police are describing a fire, they say an accelerant was used. I think her case was the accelerant, because if you think about it simply, it was somebody who wanted something for herself. There wasn't a big debate over a question of integrity or policy. It was just, no, I want this job. And Madame Anglade, who was the only person who got to make that decision, had offered it to France Benjamin, who, by the way, would have become the first black person to ever occupy one of those roles as Speaker of the National Assembly. And she had made her choice. But it turned into the Gong Show, and there are other versions of that expression that I'm not allowed to use on the radio. It turned into some kind of show, and it just took on a life of its own. And I think that watching Dominic Anglade I don't know if you got the same impression, Natasha, but she was solid.
Oh, yeah. And
there seemed to be a certain peacefulness about her as she was making this announcement. It was like, hasta la vista, good luck.
I felt for her. Like it surprised me, the emotion that I felt. You know, I mean, we've been critical. We've spoken to her many times. It's not like we know her personally per se, but you feel for a woman for anybody in that circumstance, but particularly
because you see her family, and like I was mentioning, her kids and her husband was there, and you invest so much into it. Hang on, continued, and I'm sort of going, okay, like you're not supposed to speak unkindly of somebody who's just put so much into the job and now they're walking away.
So I don't want to belabor the point, but I will simply say, and I pointed this out before, I looked at the covers of the Gazette and the Journal. Dominic Anglade is not even on the front page of the Journal, at least not on our web portal right now. But you know who is, Tom? Denis Coderre.
There you go.
With the headline, Successeur à Anglade au PLQ.
Well, I think you'd need a very particular sense of humor to believe that that's going to happen.
Let's hope
Picture's
not.
right there. That's the, I don't know why, but, his name came up when we were asking people earlier on what they thought, and then I guess it was kind of dismissed out of hand, but who knows? Stranger things have happened, right?
Yes, this is true.
Okay.
But not too many stranger things have happened.
Okay. Well, speaking of strange things, maybe not as strange, I'm wondering how you think this was handled on Ontario. So today, it's fair to say that Doug Ford gave in and said, okay, we'll start negotiating with those union, the educational system, the school support staff people, if you don't strike. And they said, okay. And up until now, he laid down the law. He introduced the notwithstanding clause. Did he handle this the right way or the wrong way?
Well, everything happens in a context. So he also got the news today that he would not have to testify before the Commission of Inquiry looking at the imposition of the Emergencies Act. And why that's important for me since the beginning, this whole use of the notwithstanding clause caused such a brush fire. It got people's minds off the fact that the Premier of the province was refusing to obey a summons. Well, in the event, the federal court said, guess what? He does have his parliamentary privilege, and they can't force him to testify. Now, that'll be another debate, whether he should have had the class to go and testify. I think he's wrong not to testify, by the way. But once that was all settled, then he turned around and he said, I am proposing a deal with the unions. You stand down, you get back to work tomorrow, I will bring in legislation. And he put it in writing. They wouldn't make their press conference was held back for an hour, saying they wouldn't hold the press conference until Ford put it in writing, which he did, saying, I'll introduce legislation removing this law that would have used the notwithstanding clause to remove your labor rights that are charter rights that are guaranteed. And he did it. And so I think that Ford comes away looking quite good, despite the fact that he caused the problem to begin with. The unions were careful not to be too triumphant in their reaction, saying we want to get back to the bargaining table. This is important for workers' rights. Big inflation numbers out there. These are average working families. They're making, like $38,000, $39,000 a year. These are not super jobs, and there's tens of thousands of people in that category. So I think that everybody took a step back from the brink. And I think that the average person in Ontario is saying, great, the kids are back in school tomorrow, and now, Ford, you better sit down and bargain in good faith.
How did they keep coming out of these things smelling like a rose, Tom? What's the secret?
Yeah,
I don't get
question.
This.
Well, I mean, he has the same secret. He has the same method as François Legault, and it's called government by focus group. These guys are constantly polling. They knew that their numbers were tanking. Trudeau went after Ford several times. I would love him to go after Legault for the use of the notwithstanding clause, but I digress. But he went after Ford several times. The reaction was very tough. And, senior commentators like, Chantal Hébert, I mean, okay, fair enough. She writes in the Toronto Star, which is very pro-liberal. But still, I mean, she's always had a very even keel in looking at these things. And it was one of the most brutal columns I've ever seen her write with regard to Doug Ford's use of the notwithstanding clause. So he did the smart thing by backing away from it because it was a loser for him. It wasn't going to work. And he had the polling numbers to show him that he was losing.
Okay. I'm just wondering, Tom, and again, to belabor the point for the second time, if you had to pick a dark horse as a potential leader for the Liberal Party of Quebec, who we may not have heard of, who's not even part of that party, who would you pick?
Right now, I don't think that person exists. I think that's going to be part of the wake-up call for the Liberal Party, because I was listening to, on the way in, I was listening to some of the people who had written to you. There was a letter from somebody who called themselves Kelly, and it was interesting. It was well argued, well put together. So, going through, then she was against Bill 96, but at first she hadn't been clear about that and this and that and the other thing. And I started going, okay, so if that's the template, if that's what everything is going to be measured against in the future, good luck. Because the Liberal Party is not going to go and get somebody who is more sympathetic to the English-speaking community than Dominic Anglade, who was very open. Her husband's an immigrant from Europe, and her kids, have a background that is really interesting, and she's got a personal history that's interesting. And so they've got this whole thing. Okay, she wasn't good enough. Fine. Okay, great. She's gone now. She's resigned. Who's your hero? And, who's the person who's going to be able to check off all of those boxes against the guy who just won 90 seats? And by the way, she did hold on to official opposition status and 20 seats of the originally 21, despite the fact that everybody said that she was going to lose even worse than that. Yeah. So okay. I'm just waiting to see who the hero is that the Liberals are going to come up with, who's going to do so much better than Dominic Anglade. Right now, to be honest with you, Aaron and Natasha, good luck.
Tom Mulcair. Thank you, Tom.